You are listening to the Mark Guzman Podcast Experience. Richmond, California, a city of pride and purpose. When one hears about the city of Richmond, they could not be faulted if the first images that come to mind centered around crime and violence. But that is not the full story of Richmond. The city of Richmond is endowed with a long, rich history that plays an important role in our own country's history. Here to shed some more light on Richmond's proud history is Melinda McCrary of the Richmond History Museum. So, Melinda, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me so much.
So, before we get started, I do want to mention the wine that we're drinking. Every guest, we always enjoy this podcast recording with a glass of wine, or we'll do even beer tasting. And so today we are drinking Unruly Rampant Chardonnay out of Manteca, California. It's a 2016. We'll link up in the description the wine where you could buy it, but I basically bought it at Bevmo. You could buy 2 bottles on the 5-cent deal right now today for $18 out the door. So it was pretty amazing deal. I really enjoy this wine. It tastes really good. How do you like it?
I like it a lot. Thank you so much for bringing my favorite wine. It's a tough job.
And one thing that's very interesting is California Chardonnays tend to mimic the Chardonnays that come out of Napa Valley, and very buttery taste to it. And this one has that buttery taste, which is, it's very delicious. How do you like it, Sam?
It's pretty good.
Yeah.
Sam's our producer, if you don't know. And okay, so let's get started. How long have you lived in the Richmond area?
I have lived in the Richmond area for about 8 years. I lived here I lived here for a couple years, and then I moved out. I moved up to Fairfield, but then I actually moved back, and now I'm here. And honestly, I'd like to stay here for forever if I can.
How do you like Fairfield? I grew up in Fairfield.
I did not like it as much as Richmond. I did not. Yeah, it was hot, and I really love the Bay Area. It's unlike any place I've ever been to. I'm from Chicago, from the Midwest area, and I love the Bay Area, but I also feel really comfortable in Richmond. I love the history. I love the people. I have a huge group of friends here now, and I really do love the city.
Yeah. I grew up in Fairfield, but moved out to Richmond probably 2005 is really when I came out, and I haven't left. I mean, I love it. The weather is just perfect here.
Yeah. And honestly, I really love the domestic architecture too. All of the old craftsman houses, and there is a lot of really. Of course, there's interesting history, and I'm biased, but there's also a lot of great architecture, both industrial architecture, commercial architecture, and a lot of interesting homes.
Have you taken a look at the city's architectural plans for the future of where they want the downtown to?
The general plans?
The general plans,
yes.
Or what they want the downtown look? It's completely different than what's out there today, and it's very unique in that they have different architecture styles. And I ran into it just maybe about a year ago when I was selling the duplex there, and the buyer wanted to find out, well, what if the duplex burns down, because it was a residential duplex and everything around it was commercial.
Right.
And it was over there by like Murdoch and 24th Street, right off McDonald.
Right.
And when we were looking at the different plans, it was really interesting to see, well, if this burns down, you have to build it with this architectural exterior style.
Yeah. Well, and I'm biased, but I tend to be in favor of saving historic buildings. And the downtown used to be all historical buildings, and I hope that we can retrofit some of those wonderful buildings in downtown rather than not destroying them and putting up new buildings in their place. I'm biased, though, of course, because I have, I'm a history person, but that there are some really beautiful buildings in the downtown area.
Is there any specific building that you would like to see saved?
Oh, definitely.
What building would that be?
The Mechanics Bank building. It's right on McDonald in the very downtown, right off of Harbor. Well, a block or so down from Harbor, and then there's a couple brick buildings on the block that's right across from Nevin Park. I believe 524 McDonald. It's a beautiful old building. I would love to see those saved.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, what's your role with the museum?
I am the executive director.
And I know we talked a little bit about Richmond, but what, and we're going to get into a lot more of this, but what has been appealing to you about working at the museum?
Well, I love both contemporary and historical Richmond. So not only am I very interested in history of Richmond all the way back to the Ohlone people, the Native Americans. That's my first love is archaeology, and so I'm very interested in the shell mounds that are on the bayfront, which there are several, and so that's one aspect of Richmond. I love that is the history, and I love that the history has important components for many different time periods. So you can look at the Ohlone people, the prehistoric period. You can look at historical period, the Mexican period with the ranchos and the Spanish mission period. There was a Asistancia, a helper farm in Contra Costa. The Mexican period with the Castro family is fascinating. And then you get into, after the city was incorporated and all the industrial history, the railroad is something that is a fascination. And then even more contemporary history. I mean, of course, I love the shipyards, and the shipyards is integral to our history. But, you look past, more recent than the shipyards, and we have a lot of civil rights history. The Black Panthers were very active here in Richmond. There was at least one court case I know that challenged discrimination in labor practices that went all the way to the state Supreme Court. So one thing about Richmond history is that there's kind of something for everyone there. And then I love the diversity of the people who live in Richmond today. And I love being able to tell that diversity of story, how everyone came to be in Richmond, and also just to, celebrate the wonderful diversity of our community and our culture. I tell people all the time, how lucky we are to live here so that we can learn so much from other people. So, I love Richmond of the past, but I also love Richmond of today. So I feel very, very lucky. I actually started my position at the museum as an intern. I was at the Museum Studies program at San Francisco State, and I was placed there to do, one of my practicum, an internship there to work with the costume collection, and which is historical clothing. And then people got jobs or went to school or moved away to be with their family, and I just moved up. So I tell all my volunteers, like, for better or for worse, you might end up the director one day, like I did. So it's a fun story that I was placed in the museum where I lived in that town, and 5 years later, here I am, the director. So
That's amazing.
yeah.
And we toured just a few weeks ago. We met you at the museum. We took a quick tour. You showed us a few things that are key there in the museum.
Yep.
So I'm really excited to jump into some of these because like I've lived in Richmond for many years, and I did not know, and I feel bad about this, but I did not know there was a museum there and all the rich history that you guys have there.
Right.
And it's amazing. I think everyone who lives in Richmond or even around Richmond should go visit.
Right.
And so what year did it open?
So the museum is housed in a Carnegie Library, and the Carnegie Library was established in 1905, and the building was a library until about 1949. It was the city's main library, at which time the city had changed dramatically with the war, which ended in World War II, which ended in 1945, and so the needs of the city outgrew the small little building. So it became a branch library in the 50s and 60s. And I'm a little bit unclear what happened to the building in the 70s, but in the late 70s, 1978 to 1980, the building was remodeled and it was turned into the museum for the Richmond Museum Association, which is a nonprofit that I work for. So, and the nonprofit was established in 1954. They were housed for a time in the Carnegie Library, and they took a they had some space in the basement, and then the city remodeled the building so that we could occupy the whole place, and we've been there ever since. And as long as we continue to operate a museum in the building, they allow us to stay there.
Now, one of the things that we discussed when we were touring the museum is that there's a lot of people that know Richmond had a really rich history during World War II and shortly after World War II.
Yep.
Now, when we were discussing this, you really wanted to focus on the history before and after
That's correct.
World War II and you introduced me to a lot more information about Richmond's history that I didn't know. So, how much history is there with Richmond prior to World War II?
There is a significant history to Richmond before World War II that goes back actually thousands of years. So the Ohlone people, our first people that lived in this area, the Native Americans who are still part of our community today, they lived in village sites on the Bay Shore for thousands of years prior to the arrival of the Spanish missionaries. And Mission Dolores in San Francisco was established in 1776, and very shortly thereafter, the mission established what's called an asistancia, or a helper farm, in Contra Costa, and that's the current name of our county. And so, people have been living in Richmond for thousands of years. After the Spanish decided that they couldn't control the missions anymore, it was just too burdensome for them when we're all the way back in Mexico City. The Mexican government took over Richmond, what is now Richmond area. And so, and that was dominated by the people who lived in what is now Richmond today, were the Castro family. And they established many adobe homes, and they had farms. They were cattle ranchers there. There was a embarcadero where they would sail ships back and forth from San Francisco. And then as the gold rush took place in 1848, 49, they the Americans started coming, and they just never stopped coming. And in 1905, the city was incorporated. The city of Richmond was incorporated. And by that time, the refinery had already been established, which was Standard Oil at that time. And the railroad had already been established. And Richmond has a very interesting geographical situation because it has very deep ports. It has a large, a significant amount of bayshore land, 32 miles of shoreline. And at that time, it still had a lot of available land. So many, many industrial companies came specifically to the Richmond area to establish their companies on the bayshore. And one of my favorite stories is Winehaven. For a period of time, the largest winemaking facility in the world was in Richmond, California. And it's the building that comprised most of Winehaven is now on the National Register of Historic Places. But one of those lesser known stories to Richmond history is Winehaven and the California Wine Company. And that, millions of barrels of wine were made here in what is now Richmond, California. And that's just the Cliff Notes version of mentioning a couple of the industries. There was a whaling station in Richmond, which is a fascinating aspect of our history that we don't really talk about all that much.
Yeah, that's so amazing. And to hear about the wine and the millions of barrels and bottles that were produced here out of Richmond.
Yes.
Now we're starting to see, and I've had a few wineries on my podcast, wineries, startup companies starting to come to Richmond, and they're creating wine out of there.
Absolutely.
And it's great. It seems like history just comes right back to the very beginning in a big giant loop.
It's cyclical. Absolutely. History is cyclical. And, the industry on the Bayshore that we had for such a long time, it might not come back in the same iteration of, large industrial factories, but I do believe that we will see a new industrial renaissance on the Bayshore, in the coming years.
Yeah. And so Richmond, definitely a big history. So founded in 1905, correct? And then
Incorporated in
incorporated in
1905.
1905.
Yep.
Then we had World War II. We had someone from Rosie the Riveter Trust over on the podcast early on when we first started. And we discussed a lot about World War II and the history and the ships and even Kaiser, who went to build Kaiser Permanente right out of Richmond.
The healthcare system, yep.
And so the history after World War II, what happened? How did Richmond then, it seems like Richmond got a boom from World War II, and how did demographics, how did the people, how did industries change after that?
That's a great question. One of the reasons why I'm so focused on looking at the history before and after the war, World War II, is because of the new National Park Service site, the World War II Rosie the Riveter National Historic Park. They do such an excellent job interpreting the history of World War II that the small little Richmond Museum can't really match that. And so, this gives us an opportunity to do a really good job with the before and the after the war. And I love to talk about what happened after the war because it demonstrates why Richmond is what it is today. Okay, so it's the loss of these tremendous industries, and the economy fell out of our city, and it has never recovered. So in 1946, World War II ended in 1945, and 75,000 people came here to work in the shipyards. And the people who came here were industrious, adventurous people who wanted a better life for themselves and their children. Okay, so in 1940, that war ended in 1945. The shipyards closed shortly after. Immediately, a huge loss of industry. The 75,000 jobs gone. So that was a huge loss to our community. And then secondly, the Ford plant closed. So the Craneway Pavilion is the former Ford assembly plant that was opened between 1931 and 1960. And Ford actually moved their factory down to Milpitas, which is now the Tesla plant. Well, again, another dramatic loss of industry that you can't really recover from. And finally, Chevron Standard Oil, they moved their corporate offices to San Ramon. And that was, again, another dramatic loss in the tax base, another dramatic loss for the economy. And it's that vacuum that has made Richmond into the place it is today. A lack of opportunity, a lack of jobs. You can talk to a lot of people in this community whose grandparents came here to work in the shipyards, very often from the Southeast, from Texas, from Arkansas. These are people of color. Henry Kaiser literally sent recruiters to that area of the world to bring people here. One of my favorite anecdotes is that one of the most common graduation gifts in the Southeast during the war was a train ticket to Richmond because the jobs were good and there was no discrimination in shipyard hiring. There was discrimination in hiring, but if you got that job, you couldn't be paid less than your white counterpart. So the people who came here, the community who came here was very industrious and very ambitious. And it's no fault of the people who live here today that has created the situation that is, poverty and violence and it's a lack of opportunity. That is that is a dramatic change. And, we are sitting just a few, not far from Hilltop, but, the final nail in the coffin, if you will, was Hilltop. When Hilltop was built, the mall, it really killed downtown. downtown Richmond. And downtown Richmond was very walkable. That's where BART station went to. And, when Hilltop opened, many of those businesses either died or moved. And, it again created a significant vacuum for the economic situation in downtown. So, it's an economic crisis that has created all of the other social ills that we are experiencing today.
And I would imagine after World War II, I mean, the population was a lot less than where we're at today. So 75,000 jobs being lost. If you heard that in a local community today, that's horrific.
Yes.
But back then, that would have been catastrophic.
There was about, and I'm not quite sure how the population changed. I can't comment on how many people left Richmond after the war, but the population today is about the same as it was during the wartime. I have to assume that, some people left, but yes, it was absolutely catastrophic, particularly because people came here to Richmond to get those jobs, and they were really good paying jobs for that time period. I was reading something the other day, and women could buy a fur coat and a diamond ring with their paycheck from the shipyards. That's how lucrative it was to work there.
Wow.
Yeah. And one of my favorite images from Richmond, World War II era Richmond, is a beautiful African-American woman in front of a sign that says Richmond Cafe, and she's wearing a beautiful fur coat. And that, and she very likely made the money to purchase that herself at the shipyards. So going from a community that is working and, earning a more than a fair wage, a good wage, to very to a significantly smaller economy is going to change things dramatically. And it did. There's no doubt.
Now, how do you see the current economy with Richmond? How do you see that changing? Because it feels like it's changed a lot in the last just 5 to 10 years.
It has. And, on a personal level, I really wish that I could have bought a house 5 years ago, because it's scary for those of us who love Richmond and live there, and are very likely going to be priced out soon.
Best time to buy was really 2009 and
exactly
10, but unfortunately that was also the time where everyone was being hurt financially.
Exactly. And I very much see Richmond as Oakland, and the gentrification of Oakland happened very quickly, and
do you see that happening here in Richmond?
I absolutely see it happening here in Richmond. I cannot, even in the Iron Triangle where the museum is located, has a pretty severe reputation for violence and poverty, and I see luxury property, real estate people coming in and selling homes, and for quite a bit of money.
Yeah, especially Marina Walk, right by the BART station.
Right. Well, and that those houses are the little craftsmen that I'm talking about. They have tons of charm, tons of character. Often, they're pretty well intact inside with all of the details, because people over the last decades didn't have a lot of money to update. So it has everything. All of those elements are in place for gentrification to take place, and it is rapidly, absolutely.
Now let's talk about the museum, and this kind of flows right into the museum, because one of the great features that you have at the museum is you get underneath, I don't know what you call it, but it's round, and you can see pictures of Barrett and McDonald and right there downtown where Richmond used to be. Yeah. And right now, there are a lot of homes.
Yes.
But back then, in those black and white photos, there were very few homes. It seemed like maybe 1 or 2 houses per block.
Right.
And that's just amazing to see all the open land, and now
so
full
quickly.
of houses.
Right. Well, Richmond today at one time was largely agricultural. It was cattle ranching. It was there were a lot of nurseries, Japanese flower growing nurseries. Part of the reason why is because the climate is so fantastic that it's a perfect climate for growing. And even going back to the Spanish and Mexican period, they were out in Contra Costa practicing agriculture as well, particularly cattle ranching. And the artifact you're referring to is a panoramic of Richmond in 1914. So it's just about 100 years ago. And yes, one of my favorite things to do is crowd a big group of school children under that, I call it a hood, and say, where are all the houses? Because it is dramatically empty compared to what it is today. And the city really filled in with homes as a result of World War II and all the people who came in during World War II.
Now, significant events that happened in Richmond. I know you have a few exhibits there, and we'll get into those in a minute. But what are 3 significant events that happened here in the city of Richmond?
Okay. So one of those I would say would be, the establishment of when Francisco Castro got his first land grant. And that was very early on during the Mexican period. He was a soldier for the Mexican government, and he, as a reward for his service, he was given a large piece of land. And so that was the first European settlement in our area. And that was really significant because, it established the European presence, long-term family and homes within our area. Okay, so that's one thing. I would also say, the refinery. You cannot talk about Richmond history without referring to the refinery. And the refinery was established in 1902, so just a couple years
Which is now Chevron, correct?
Yes. So it was Standard Oil at first, and then it did become Chevron. But and Standard Oil and the railroad were just a couple years apart, and they really, one followed the other. The railroad came, and then the Standard Oil came, likely as a result of having that transportation access. And so that, another, very significant period in our history where a lot of people came to Richmond specifically to work at the refinery, at Standard Oil. And then I'm going to go skip over the shipyards and go to something a little bit more recent. But, I would say the killing of Denzel Dahl in 1968 was a dramatic event because it really started the activity of the Black Panthers in Richmond. And, Black Panthers are very often known to be active in Oakland, but they really organized around events that took place in Richmond. The Black Panthers did. So Denzel Dahl was a young man who was killed by Contra Costa Sheriff's officers, and his body was laid in the street overnight. He was found by his family members in the morning, and his mother called the Panthers up to Richmond because she had heard about what they were doing in Oakland. And the Panthers ended up speaking with Contra Costa Sheriff's Office to say, what's going to happen. And I've heard colloquially that one of the officers said, well, if you don't like it, then you can go to Sacramento. And they did just that. They took their guns to Sacramento and, some people would say invaded the Capitol, but they went to the Capitol, and it was that really catapulted the Black Panthers into the national spotlight because there were a bunch of reporters there trying to cover a picnic for Reagan, then Governor Reagan, who had invited a bunch of school children there. So, Richmond had a significant role in this incredible social movement that went national. And although, most of us really speak or recognize Oakland as a the city where the Panthers were born, which, yes, they were. Richmond also had a very significant role in the development of that social movement.
Wow.
It's amazing. And again, I'm looking to expand the knowledge of what happened before and after the war. And I'm also really interested in the recent past. I'm in my late 30s, and a lot of people my age are very interested in the recent past. And not some people think, oh, well, that it's not historical yet, but it is starting to now become historical. It's just hitting that threshold that we consider to be historical here in the States of 50 years. And that is another area of history that we can really be proud of, and that can really change the idea of what Richmond is. It's not just a place that we saw protests in the 60s and violence and other negative things. We can also look at it for the positive, and there is a lot of positive.
There is.
Absolutely.
I mean, just on this podcast alone, I've been interviewing people like yourself and many other individuals here in Richmond that, they're bringing a lot of positivity from their business and what they do and how they get involved within the community.
Right. And I am often fatigued at the media and what the media chooses to cover, because it's not about the young volunteers who are, doing their community service at the museum, or, my colleague that I work with who, Evelyn Santos, who's Richmond raised, Richmond born, and now she went to Mills College, and now she's, she could go get a better job somewhere else, but she's choosing to now come back to Richmond and work in nonprofits. She works at the museum, and she also works at Building Blocks for Kids. So it is, it's one narrative but it's not the only narrative.
Yeah,
it's not the only narrative.
Exactly. And it's very unfortunate. And the problem with many news channels is that they go for the ratings. And when you have crime, when you have things that can scare people and keep them watching the television, that's where the ratings are at. And they're going to highlight those. Richmond's a very big city. And a lot of the crime happens in very small pocket neighborhoods.
Exactly.
It's not the entire city.
Well, that's true. And then you look at the conditions that are in those neighborhoods where crime is taking place, and it is dramatically. There are some serious social ills. Lack of opportunity. The schools are terrible. Homelessness is a real problem, and hopelessness is also a problem in some of those areas. So when we, and doing podcasts like this, and the museum and the, Rosie the Riveter Center and other businesses can work to change that narrative, it's going to again be a game changer for our city.
It is. Now, in your opinion, this might be a little bit off topic, but how do you think? What would be the first start in order to fix some of the problems?
I am a big believer in social justice through education. So I would love to see us invest more in our youth, and instill a sense of pride in the youth of Richmond, so that they know what to be proud of. Because if we're not proud of our own history and what we have, then we can't expect other people to do that. And I would love to see more funding to history education. I mean, so that would fill two of my wishes. But if we could. I've said this before. If you give me 45 minutes of your time in the museum, I can completely change your idea of what Richmond is. And if I can do that for our school kids, and then send them out to tell other people how amazing Richmond is, we could change the whole story of Richmond, of what Richmond is and what Richmond is going to be. So I very strongly believe in investing in our young people.
That's great. And how much does it cost to enter the Richmond Museum?
So it's the admission fee is $5 for adults or $3 for seniors or students. Kids are always free, and because we have some individuals in our community who do live in poverty, we offer free admission with a library card through the Discover and Go program, which is a program through the Contra Costa County Library. So anyone who has a library card can print out as many passes as they want to get into the museum. But if you can afford it, we ask for you for a $5 admission fee. And we're a nonprofit, and we do not get any funding from the city. They allow us to live in the building, but we don't get any cash from them. So we raise the vast majority of the money that we spend.
Okay. And then I assume on the website there's do you have a donation button?
We do, absolutely.
Great.
Yeah.
So for those interested in even if they can't go in person, they can go to the website and donate.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. Now, one thing that really surprised me at the museum was your research room, because I've never been inside of a museum or a city hall research room before. And you always have the picture, you always see it in movies when people are doing investigative work and they go to this research room with old books and magazines. And so it's really like that.
Yeah.
And you have a ton of old books there,
Absolutely.
Maps, all kinds of information, newspaper clippings too.
Tons, yes.
And so anyone can go there and do research, correct?
Absolutely. And you don't, although we suggest that you make an appointment just so that we can, kind of consider your topic, you don't even have to make an appointment. A lot of people come in and, I'll mention to them, you should go look your home up in the city directories, because we have what I call them the phone books before the phone, all the way back to 1908. So, we have the most significant collection of research material and primary sources in West County, bar none. Absolutely. Because we started collecting in 1951. So when people were looking for organizations to donate their significant historical materials to, they came to the Richmond Museum. And it's a testament to the volunteers and the staff who came before me that, we've had some of those items in our collection for over 60 years. So that's actually a really incredible for a small local history society. So we have phone books. We have the city directories, which are, like I said, phone books before the phone. We have yearbooks from, very far back. We have thousands of photographs. We have a local research library that has some rare books. We have 400 maps of not just Richmond, but the whole Bay Area. We have employee newsletters, both from Standard Oil / Chevron and the Kaiser shipyards. Kaiser Permanente now, or Kaiser Health Organization, they come to us to do research because we have a much deeper archive than they even do. So, there's no additional fee to do research. We are very eager to get our collections into the hands of the public and to provide public access to our collections. It's a non-circulating library, so you're not going to be able to check anything out. But anytime you want to come in and look at during our open hours, the research room is always open. We're very proud of that. We're proud of being able to not only be a museum with exhibits, but also a repository of significant historical materials.
So let's talk about some of the exhibits there. The one, as soon as you go up to the main floor, the one that is right there in front that stands out is you have the black Ford.
Yes,
so let's
absolutely.
talk about that.
Yeah. So we have a 1931 Model A Ford that was either the first or the third off of the assembly line at the Ford assembly plant, which is now the Craneway Pavilion. It's a destination in our city, which is right on the bayfront. It's a beautiful old building, brick building with a lot of natural light. And there's a great story behind that Ford. So it was either purchased or given to the city by Ford for the city manager to drive. And the city manager's name was Mr. McVitie. And just as a testament to the continuity of our city, his daughters are still members of our museum. They're in their 90s, but Florence and Mary are still involved, and they still receive our newsletter. And Mr. McVitie drove the Ford for several years, probably for a lot of city relations, also probably for some advertising. And it is an absolutely beautiful, beautiful historical object. We, the Richmond Museum Association, purchased the car from the city for $1, and Ford. When Ford was in Milpitas, they restored it for us. So it is actually in mint condition, and we have the keys for the car, but it wouldn't turn on right now because it doesn't have fluids or a battery. But the Ford is absolutely the marquee of our exhibit. And it's such a powerful educational tool as well, because everybody's driven in a car. You know, you have to be born under a rock to not have driven in a car. And so everyone can relate to it, and it gives a great physical example of how technology changes. So I always ask, our young visitors, where do you put the baby seat in this car? And of course, there's no back seat, so there's nowhere to put the baby seat. There's no seat belts. There's no, technology has changed dramatically. So, it's not only is it a beautiful, beautiful piece of machinery, but it's also a very powerful educational tool, and it's able to reach some of those young people that maybe don't, or reach people who are not really interested in history.
Well, you had a great story of a little child,
yes,
that was not into history, but as soon as he saw the car, he lit up.
Well, and that is one of my favorite experiences in the museum is, he was a young adult, maybe 12, 13, 14. And we say, he was just too cool for school. He did not want to be there. He thought it was the most boring thing ever. And all of this history, he wasn't interested in it. But when he saw that car, he absolutely came alive. And he was telling me about the carburetor and how it was different than the carburetors today because we have the hood open. And, that car really reached that child. And it gave him a whole new experience, about history and what history can be. And, he left the museum with a positive experience. And that's one aspect of the Richmond Museum that I feel is very important, is that it's a little tiny place, but there is something in there for everyone. Whether you like the railroad or Native Americans or, cars or the shipyards in World War II or, women's social history or civil rights, you can find it at the Richmond Museum.
And you have the old Reed boat there.
We do. Now, the Reed boat, it is a modern reproduction. It's a Thule boat, or a Thule balsa, and it was actually I had a visitor who was involved in making that boat as a young man, which was wonderful. And this is part of our Native American exhibit, and yes, the Thule balsa, which was the canoe that the Native peoples used to sail the bay in, and they had a Native advisor come out, and this was in the 70s, and help them gather all the reeds, all the Thule that they needed, and they put it all together. And yes, it is there. It's one of the first things that you see when you come into the museum. And we are working hard in fundraising now to update the exhibit, because it could use a facelift. It's just time. And so we're hoping to have a new interactive exhibit with, involving modern museum technique and method and theory.
You show me some preliminary designs and drawings that you have
we
of
do.
It. Looks amazing.
Yes. And we're working with a local company that's right in the Triangle, Scientific Art Studio, to do all those drawings and to help us design that. And not only that, but we are working very closely with the modern Native American community as well to ensure that there's a strong Native voice, and that they're very well represented, and that not only do they agree with what we're doing, but that that they can tell their own story rather than me telling their story. And that's something that I find important, not just for Native peoples, but for all of the for all the exhibits that we do, is to really hear from the community, and let them tell, be a conduit for people to tell their own story rather than us saying, well, this is how it was for them.
How would the new exhibit be interactive?
So we're really excited we have a couple interactive pieces. One of them is one of my favorites is we're going to give people an opportunity to weave a basket like Native women would have done, and it's a large it's a little bit hard to explain, but the interactive will be a large frame of a twined basket, and we're going to provide malleable, flexible slats that people can then weave within this large frame. And that will literally give people the experience on a much larger scale, right? Because it's going to be much larger than a regular basket, but it will allow people to experience what it was like to weave a basket. So that's one interactive. And then another very exciting thing that we're going to do is we'll have Native people speaking the language, the Chochenyo language, which was supposed to be dead, although it's now being revitalized with the use of some of the old recordings and old records and things like that. So, and language is such a it's one of those aspects that really make us human, and so it's very important for me and for the Native peoples to demonstrate that not only did they have their own language, in the past, but they're now working again to revitalize the language, despite all the historical injustices that they've gone through over the last 100 years.
And I would imagine that's a lot of work to put something like that to revive a language.
Yes, and it's a testament to the modern people. This is not something that I have been involved in at all. It's all up to the Native. It's all a result of the efforts of the Native peoples. The Muwekma tribe of the San Francisco Bay Area has had a language revitalization committee for many years, and that work has been built upon by a young gentleman named Vincent Medina, who has a great Tumblr account called Being Alone in the 21st Century, and he's also working really hard to revitalize a lot of the language. And anthropologists in the early 20th century went out and made recordings of some of the last speakers of the Chochenyo language, and they also made handwritten records, which is forming the basis of that revitalization.
And then, do you also have I know there's a lot of black and white photos inside the museum, but do you go through the process of bringing some of these black and white photos into color?
That is not something we have the budget for at this time.
It's expensive, right?
It is. We would love to do that. But even if we did have the budget, I'm not sure that we would be focusing on that. I think first we would want to focus on doing more educational programs. But yes, we have actually a significant amount of negatives that we still need to develop. There's one particular collection, a post-war collection of primarily African-American images that, we have over 400 negatives that we would love to have them developed into prints, and we don't even really know what's in there. And Mr. Myers, the photographer, he actually photographed, a few significant events in our history, like a protest at the Lucky's store when, Lucky's was doing discriminatory hiring practices. So, who knows what's in there? There is so much to yet still be discovered in our collection that it's really I always say, like, discover mysteries in the museum. You can do it right here in Richmond. You don't have to watch the show because there's still so much within our collection that we still need to learn more about because we've been collecting for so long.
Maybe we could find someone that can donate their services to get those developed.
I would love to. And it's a very interesting collection because it shows an affluent African American community after the war, and there are just not very many collections like this with such a large number of images. So we do have a few of them developed. One of my favorite of his images is an African American Boy Scout troop, and all these young men are in their Boy Scout uniforms, and they've got a beautiful Richmond flag, and it's just incredible. It really is, to have that snapshot of the African American community in Richmond from that time.
Well, everything sounds amazing and interesting. I love the history of it. So, where's the museum located?
The museum is located at 400 Nevin Avenue, in just about 6 blocks from the downtown BART station. And it's a safe walk it's a straight shot from the BART station down to the museum. You walk past the Social Security Administration building, and then Kaiser Permanente Hospital, and then the Nevin Center. So it's close to public transportation. And we are open Wednesday through Sunday from 1 to 4 p.m. And you can find us online at www.richmondmuseum.org.
Perfect. Well, I want to thank you for coming on to the podcast. This was a lot of fun. The wine was fantastic. The history's even better. So thank you so much. And I know we could keep going on, and we'll have to have you come back for another episode, and
Great.
we'll maybe talk about the future of Richmond
That
and where we
sounds
see
wonderful.
things going.
Yeah.
And so again, thank you for being on the podcast. We'll link up everything in the description. And
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really delighted to be here and to talk about Richmond history. And, we've only just really scratched the surface with this conversation. So, please, if you have questions, feel free to reach out. I love working with the community. If you're a teacher and you want to bring your class, don't hesitate to contact me, because that is one of my primary goals, is to get more school groups in with teachers, and to make a good connection there.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. Thank you to our producer, Sam Lubman. Please go check out the Richmond Museum of History on their website. Donate. Go visit. There's a ton of really good information, very easy to access. Thank you again for listening to the podcast. Make sure to rate it. Give us any feedback. We would greatly appreciate it. And don't forget to like, comment, and share. I really, really want to thank all of you for listening. It means the world to me, and I hope today's episode provides you value in your day-to-day life. I created this podcast to help showcase the many great people that live in this world, and help share some knowledge that I've learned along the way in life. Again, thank you for listening. Check out our sponsors, and I'll catch you on the next episode.